If you're wondering what other wheel arrangements that I want to do next, I hope on doing either the 262 Prairie types or the 280 consolidations. And I don't think either of those will be any easier, if at all. And until next time, sparkle, sparkle, sparkle. Now, what does the consolidation list look like? Oh, what about the prairies? Oh, come on. The 280 type, also called consolidations or connies for the most part.
Connie?
I can't decide which one of you I'm going to kiss first.
Was a locomotive type that became a principal hauler on many railroads, big and small, beginning in the late 19th century. The first 280 was built for the Lehigh Valley and gained the name Consolidation from the consolidation of the Beaver Meadow, Penhaven, and Whitehaven Railroad and the Lehigh and Mahanoy Railroads into the Lehigh Valley. The name would stick, but at first many railroads did not order consolidations, as many railroads at the time favored the 440 proud to be an American type locomotive over the consolidations. But by the 1870s, the consolidation type would be heavily ordered by the Pennsylvania Railroad, and many others would soon follow. These investments in connies paid off for many railroads at the time, as they pulled sometimes even twice as much as their 440 predecessors. However, later on, the connies would be bumped off to lower-level assignments by Mikados, Mountains, Northerns, and even big articulateds as trains became heavier and longer. But that does not mean that they were completely forgotten about, as many connies would later be preserved. And although not every connie made it into preservation, they're still very significant, and they are what I'll be talking about in this video. In this video, I'll be talking about consolidations from every North American railroad, as usual, alphabetical order, and will include connies that a railroad got from another railroad. Subsidiaries will only be included if their connies were separate from their owners, so subsidiary railroads like the Rio Grande Southern won't be mentioned, as the RGS was a Denver and Rio Grande Western subsidiary, not a separate road. Same goes for the Oregon Railroad and Navigation and the El Paso and Southwestern. With that out of the way, here's every North American 280 type described in 15 words or less. Some of the few new steam locomotives bought by the railroad. Army connies for Alaska and the biggest survivors for the ARR. Vauclane compounds for a railroad serving south central Ontario. And some from the MNSTL too. Diamond stack connies for a railroad that logged, then mined. Now with the ability to run on 60 to 75 pound rail. Serving a branch line east of Alamogordo and getting sent to the EP&SW later on. Later becoming the Alexander and Eastern, then sold off. A mandated coal variant with a cylindrical tender, later sold off to many other railroads until being cut up in 1929. Reliable little freight engines for Michigan. Now with several connies surviving, including one connie from the New York Central, serving the ACL well, with one surviving but in deplorable condition, getting sold off to other railroads later on. Diamond stack connies that were originally for the Rio Grande. A.J. Cromwell survives, camelback connies, and standard connies forgotten about. The loyal iron horses of the state of Maine with some Bostonian friends. Later sold to the Woodward Iron and survives today in Calera, Alabama. Wait a minute, are you telling me that Iowa had a narrow gauge 280? Later coming under ownership of the Pennsylvania Northwestern and the PRR. mandated logging variants, with one sold to the Valley Railroad and survives. Later sold to the Alabama Central and survives, but is in bad shape. A mandated logging variant for Monroe County, Alabama. Connie's working for a railroad that worked with the Cotton Belt. The backbone of New England Rail, sold to other lines, all reduced to scrap. Later sent to the Pittsburgh, Shawmut, and Northern Railroad. The few steam locomotives that were in service up to the 1960s. Also, one survives. Early Connies for a line battling the Erie and dead by World War I. Connies of the biggest little railroad in the world, displaced by electrics and adopted by GN. Oh my god, it's so small! It deserves a head pat. Can I pat it, please? Do you want a regular or camelback locomotive with your meal, sir? Mandated coal variants for Western Pennsylvania and all dead by 1944. More mandated coal variants serving a relatively small West Virginian coal railroad. Connies of many Canadian railways, with several now in preservation. Reliable mainline and local freight engines, with one in excursion service. And one underwater. I didn't expect a kind of preserved Canadian steam locomotives inquisition. Later sold to the Internacional Mexicano, serving the Carolinas through a southern subsidiary and retired before the 1950s. Reliable coal haulers of the Appalachian Mountains and the actual Clinchfield 311. And now we're back to the mandated logging variants. The mandated plantation variant, exclusive to Cuba, with some still around today. Later sold to all sorts of different railroads. A mandated sugar variant for the island of Puerto Rico. Now coming as camelback locomotives. Now serving for a CN subsidiary in Vermont. One of the main haulers for the CFG, with one still around today. This existed. Probably. Later converted into a 282, but kept its number. Now with one surviving at Covington, West Virginia. Hello again, Chicago squad. Really useful little Connies for the C&A and dead by the 50s. Some original, some rebuilt with superheating, some ex-Frisco, all forgotten about. Reliable engines for the C&IM, with one getting sold and converted to a Mikado. Zulus for the Northwestern and the Omaha Road that are small and quite unknown.
I'm Great Western, and don't we know it's Great Road?
Connies for a railroad under the NYC for Chicago's Dearborn Station, serving the plains in the Front Range, with some from its Colorado subsidiaries surviving. Somewhat small but still reliable locomotives for the Hoosier Line. Also,
oh, up and down the Mona, everything is fine, 'cause that rootin' tootin' Mona, she's a Hoosier Line. Oh, up and down the Mona, everything is fine, 'cause that rootin' tootin' Mona, she's a Hoosier Line.
The Milwaukee Road
locomotives serving the Midwest and the Northwest. Do you want a high or a centered headlight and a regular or part wheelback tender? Mexican Connies for the mountain grades of the El Chepe. Connie locomotives for Mexico that later served under NDM. Narrow gauge Connies serving some of the highest states in Mexico, with several still standing. Of the typical generic consolidation design for the CNW. Rio Grande consolidation copies serving the first standard gauge railroad in the Colorado Rockies. Standard gauge consolidation serving the Cripple Creek mining district, but going on the shorter route. More generic design consolidations for the Pacific Northwest. Later sold to the Colitz, Chehalis, and Cascade Railway and survives, but in terrible shape. Connies serving a South Carolinian short line well and dead by 1951. Served under various railroads and doesn't survive. the big boys of the Copper Range, with one surviving at the MCRM, serving the only other standard gauge railroad in Alaska. One of the biggest steam locomotives for the Cornwall and lasted until 1950. A mandated mining variant for Arizona and New Mexico. More mandated coal variants for Nova Scotia. More coal variants for Southern Railway subsidiary. This existed. Probably. Mandated logging variants for the hills of South Dakota, serving one of the hottest places on Earth with one still standing. Seems alright to me. Okay, it's a camelback. Is that the polar... Wait, stop. Do you want a standard locomotive or a camelback locomotive with your fries, sir? Built for the top of the world, died on the Rio Grande. The biggest haulers on the narrow gauge until the Mikados arrived. Several rebuilt into narrow gauge Mikados, and the only survivor of standard gauge steam, 683. Small Connies running west of Denver, and now the oldest surviving steam locomotives in Colorado. The only camelback locomotives in Mexico. Later sold to the Caslo and Slocan Railway, serving a railroad that went to Mackinac, but not Detroit. Hauled the freight of the DT&I well, and outclassed by Mikados and Berkshires. Berkshire? I don't know. A mandated logging variant, this time for Florida. Later became a part of the N&W. Now with several surviving, including a 1218 imposter and one from the D&E, which is an icon for the North Shore Scenic Railroad with a sister on the Sierra Railroad, serving a railroad that never actually made it to the Atlantic Ocean. Now forever abandoned in the woods of Maine. For eastern British Columbia, not much else to say. Narrow gauge and later standard gauge Connies for the pretty little Tweetsy, but none survive. Later rebuilt into 080s and dead by the end of the 40s. Later sold to other railroads and survives at a Christian youth camp at Lake Gaston. Guess the 100 had the good grace of God on its side if it made it into preservation like that. Would you like a regular tender or a Vanderbilt tender for your meal, sir? Connies for Copper Country in Wisconsin and northern Michigan. Narrow gauge Connies of central Nevada outstarred by the Eureka. Another relatively unknown steam locomotive for Puerto Rico. Mandated mining variants of the Mexican narrow gauge for Chihuahua. Also, I didn't know until after I made part 2, but one of the locomotives that worked for them is now preserved as Thunder Lake Lumber Company 5. Just wanted to let you know. Once again, mandated logging variants for Mississippi. More mandated logging variants for Arizona and sold off to other railroads later on. The few locomotives that made it into the 60s with one still standing. This apparently existed. Served the Grand Trunk well in all sorts of work, but weren't lucky enough to escape the tort. Serving a railroad going between Great Falls, Montana and Lethbridge, Alberta. Also, as a side note, I put a photo unknown on top of here because the only photo I was able to find of a Great Falls in Canada 280 was protected, and I wasn't in the mood to worry about the author, copyright striking me. So, sorry about that. Rugged, powerful, and green consolidations for the Great Northern Railway, with 2 surviving. Serving the plains of northeastern Colorado and now survives on the Black River in western. Small Connies that could ride on 70-pound rail and with 49 still around. A mandated logging variant for Arizona that now survives in Flagstaff. Later became a part of the Dismal Swamp Railway. A mandated steel variant for New Miami, Ohio. Standardized variants for the Harriman lines with one still around but needs restoration. with a smaller gauge than most other railroads and includes some camelbacks too. Narrow gauge Connies for a railroad in central Mexico. Connies for a railroad in central North Carolina. Later completely disposed of before the railroad was bought by the C&O. A mandated coal variant that became an excursion star and set to return on the Everett Railroad. With one that became an excursion star and has since settled in Scranton. And also a locomotive that was once driven by Casey Jones himself. More mandated coal variants for Virginia's western mountains. More Connies for Nova Scotia coal country, serving a small narrow gauge railroad that doesn't go past 30 miles. Later sold to the AL&L and the Sumter Lumber Company. This one existed. Probably. Coming with the option of either regular tenders or Vanderbilt tenders. Connies for a railroad with ambitious goals. That didn't get too far. Later sold to the BC&G and survives as number 14. Later sold off to various other railroads. A mandated logging variant for western Pennsylvania this time around. More narrow gauge Connies for Michigan's Upper Peninsula, serving a railroad that rapidly expanded and rapidly contracted, with several being sold and later becoming icons for many heritage railroads across America. Oh yeah, and again, did I ever mention mandated logging variant? Now a staple and an icon of the New Hope and Ivy Land Railroad, with big regular locomotives and camelbacks included in the combo, all reduced to scrap by the end of World War I. Would you like your locomotive to be a regular or a camelback locomotive, sir? Some of the first consolidations ever built for a railroad that later came under the CNJ, and once again, a mandated coal variant. The first consolidations built, and including several camelback locomotives later on. Western Pennsylvanian later sold off to the Chicago and Western Indiana Railroad. Reliable freight engine Connies for the Pennsy subsidiary, the Long Island Railroad.
Who summoned me?
More mandated mining variants for Virginia, serving a railroad that never made it to West Virginia, now a staple of the Virginia and Truckee Railroad. Later sold off and survives at the Illinois Railway Museum. Some of the earliest Connies built, and outshined by newer and bigger Connies, as well as other locomotives. Originally bound for Cuba, but made a living on a New York short line, and is preserved. Reliable freight engines for Maine, and 2 out of 3 Maine Central survivors. One of the last steamers in regular service, achieved movie fame, now on display at Galveston, Texas. Damn, I went a bit over, did I? Later ending up in the hands of the Katy. Later ending up in the hands of the Lake Superior and Ishpeming. Later becoming a part of the Frankfort and Cincinnati Railroad. Small but really useful locomotives for the Ma and Pa. Originals don't survive, but a Susquehanna and New York Connie carries on their spirit. Mandated logging variants for not Mississippi, but Louisiana. It likely worked for this railroad pretty well. Not much else to say. Serving a major petroleum company in Mexico. Serving one of the biggest pre-nationalization railways in Mexico. For a small railroad in the state of Michoacan. Serving a Texas and Pacific subsidiary, which was a MOPAC subsidiary. More mandated sugar variant Connies of Cuba, with many surviving into preservation. More mandated mining variants for Michigan. The only surviving steamer of the MNSTL that's forced to look at her abandoned line. one of the main freight engines of the Sioux, with a few now in preservation. Wait, what was this railroad again? Serving a railroad that never gained the customers it desired. Also, I hope the 280s aren't being confused for 080. Serving a Mississippi short line that connected with the major Class 1 railroads. Serving a railroad that had a really sad story. A useful freight locomotive and a Connie that had the worst preservation luck. Also, I heard somewhere that the Mopac was actually shocked when the city of Dupo actually did this. To be fair, I don't really blame them. Wait, since when did the Katy even have a Connie that was also numbered 630? Originally for Brazil, ended up in Alabama. Received so poorly by the railroad that 2/3 of them were scrapped by 1940. Mandated copper variants for Nacozari de Garcia. Mandated coal variants serving southwestern Pennsylvania. Serving a less-known southern Montana coal line that connected with the northern Pacific. Serving the steel mills of Monterey. Serving a railroad in eastern Arizona that didn't even last 25 years. Serving a railroad that took over an old interurban line. Mandated coal variants for southern British Columbia and connecting with CP Rail and GN. An eastern Texan mandated logging variant, a mandated mining variant from New Jersey. Sold to the Lake Superior and Ishpeming Railroad and survives but is in restoration hell. More mandated copper variant Connies of northern Mexico. Local and mainline freight Connies serving the Dixie Line. Arrived from Cuba, worked in Louisiana's woods, then sent back to Cuba later on. Some of the last steam engines in regular service, with several surviving. Usted quiere que su locomotora de vapor sea de vía estándar o de vía estrecha? Also, I got my mom to translate that from English to Spanish, so huge shout out to my mom for doing that for me, since I don't exactly trust Google Translate. Sold to the Tonopah and then the Sumter Valley. Serving a lonely line in western Nevada before being sold to the Sierra Railway. Really useful in regular service and staples of the Nevada Northern in tourist service. Bull Moose Connies keeping the New Haven's freight operations going. But none survived. Connies from a Mopac subsidiary coming under Mopac ownership later on. Some of the biggest Vauclin compounds with a mid-1800s style design. Working for a short line connecting with the Erie and gone before World War II. One of the biggest Connie fleets for the Central, with one surviving indirectly in Oklahoma. One of the more forgotten about steamers of the Nickel Plate. A mostly forgotten about Connie type from a mostly forgotten about railroad. Now survives and is a staple of the Arcade and Attica Railroad. Serving a belt railroad connecting many railroads to Norfolk's ports. Coming in many variations and with several surviving into preservation. Connies of the original NS and survives as a Atlanta and Western locomotive. Not as well remembered as other NP steamers, but lucky enough for one to survive. Serving the island of Oahu well, but also wasn't lucky enough for preservation. Serving a line between Oaxaca and Ejutla. Yeah, I'm not very good at pronouncing these names. Lucky enough to survive into preservation, but it deserves a headlight. Served the railway well and survives today at Steamtown. Serving a short line in Arkansas. Narrow gauge Connies for the West Coast. That didn't make it past World War II. Serving British Columbia well and now with one sunk under sea and lake. Mandated phosphate variants this time around. Would you like a small, standard, medium, or large boiler with your Connies? Do you want a small or regular tender with your fries, sir? Camelback engines and standard engines that were rebuilt into 484s, with 4 surviving into preservation. Also, as a side note, I created this part right after Reading 2100 was fired up for the first time in decades. An ex-Texan turned Mississippian, man, now with regular, Vanderbilt, and these kinds of tenders. Yeah, I wasn't able to pin down a specific design for those tenders, sorry. Late 19th century designs for the PB and LE, serving a short line through eastern Ohio and western Pennsylvania, later taken up by the NYC. Served the railroad well, but was later outclassed by 282s. More mandated sugar variants for Puerto Rico. Wait, how many of these locomotives from Mississippi were there? Wood-burning Connies working along a river in San Luis Potosi. Another sugar variant that was sadly stripped away for parts after retirement. Highly unknown and later replaced by a decapod. More narrow gauge Connies for the Torch Lake area and a survivor this time around. Built at the turn of the century and coming under Burlington ownership later on. War of Independence locomotives, probably, with one still standing and operational, serving its railroad well. And forgotten not long afterward, serving a railroad that went along the Rio Grande, but never reached Eagle Pass, a mandated coal variant for Virginia. Now survives today in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. Later sent to the Crab Orchard in Egyptian Railway, and the very last revenue service steam locomotive in America ever. Yeah, I went well over the word limit, but I think it's worth it, especially since this locomotive was in service up until 1987. Yes, 1987. That was when the last revenue steam locomotive in America was retired. And luckily, it is on display. Serving the Rutland Railroad well, but still gone before preservation could save any one of them. Obtained from a Buffalo and Susquehanna order, and later sent to the Illinois terminal. Later sold to the New Orleans, Texas, and Mexico Railroad. Some of the smallest superheated 280s ever built. Original doesn't survive, but was replicated with Lake Superior and Ishpeming 18, serving a rail line along the eastern coast of Mexico. A rather unknown Connie from an unknown Utah railroad that was taken over by the Rio Grande. Original SAL Connie's dead, but Gainesville Midland Connie donated by the SAL survives. Yeah, I mentioned the preserved Gainesville Midland Connie just in case it counted. So, if anyone's a fan of this locomotive, well, there you go. Narrow gauge Connies for tight bends and steep grades in eastern Arizona, later becoming a Nevada Northern locomotive. Serving the Sierra well in regular service and a star in her own right today. Heh, get it? Star? Because she at one point had a star painted around her number? Anyways, a mining Connie for a railroad connecting the mines around Silverton, Colorado. And yes, I mean Silverton, Colorado. It is that Silverton, where it's the northern terminus for the Durango and Silverton. A lot of forgotten railroads, huh? Another Connie from a railroad that ran to the mines north of Silverton. And yes, same Silverton. Later outperformed by Mike's. Working for a steel mill in Birmingham, Alabama, and a few sold to the original Norfolk Southern. Basically copies of the Buffalo, Rochester, and Pittsburgh 280s. An unlucky number Connie serving a narrow gauge railroad that was bought by the SP. I have certainly not decreased Stockton Suburbs' hatred of the Southern Pacific at this point. Later taken up by the Southern Pacific, ran on the Southern, sent to the ET and WNC, and then became excursion stars. The SP's main branch line engines and many still around across the former SP system. A mandated logging variant for Chippewa County, Wisconsin. Later sold off to the Interstate Railroad. A wood-burning Connie of southeastern Virginia, outshined by her 260 counterpart. One sold to the Meridian in Bigby and the sole survivor of M&B Steam, serving a relatively small and unknown shortline railroad in northern Georgia, serving the backwoods of Ontario and with several making it into preservation. A very less known Connie that served central Tennessee. Baldwin Connies for the tag, with one surviving as a Fordyce in Princeton locomotive.
Sexy century. Nope. Do this Hexas style.
Serving a small railroad that was later taken over by the Katy. Originally for the Lake Superior and Southern, sent to Louisiana. Wait, this was a railroad that existed? Serving a subsidiary of the Virginian. Why do most of these Mexican Connies have so little info about them? Finally, a pick and some info! A terminal Connie serving railroads heading into Toledo and its industries. Early narrow gauge Connies that were later on sent to Cuba. Serving a railroad crossing central Illinois and dead before 1950. These existed and now they don't. Connie serving a gold and silver mine railroad and coming with Vanderbilt tenders. Now once again coming with Vanderbilt tenders. Regular tenders optional too though. Serving its respective railroad well and now on display at its respective home. Serving its Southern Ontario home well and with one now on display. Serving the hottest region in California collecting, well, Trona. The Thunder of Chattanooga! Serving the Uintah Basin well, with one member that worked for them now surviving. Narrow gauge Connies for the Yucatan Peninsula. Branch line Connies of the Unipac, with many preserved and one running on the Heber Valley. Now watching her 10-wheeler sisters haul all the tourist trains. An early narrow gauge Connie for San Luis Potosi. Another Connie serving the eastern coast of Mexico. And now a Minnesotan mandated logging variant. Working for a sawmill in Alabama. Superheated short-haul Connies for the Wabash, serving a subsidiary of the Wabash in Pittsburgh. Wait, what was this railroad again? The quintessential Southern shortline locomotive and now a staple of the Three Rivers Railroad. Connie serving an intra-state railroad in Washington, D.C. Originally coal burners and later converted to oil firing. Serving the backcountry of North Carolina. Serving a Texas and Pacific branch line west of Fort Worth. Originals long gone, but their spirits live on through a Lake Superior and Dishpemig Connie. Later worked for the Nacionales de Mexico and Petróleo Mexicano. Reliable freight locomotives for the Feather River route, with one now in preservation. Serving the W&LE well, although a few were sold to the Wabash later on. With a few preserved and 69 running, but not nearly as well known as her Mikado counterparts. One more Camelback Connie for central Pennsylvania. A logging railroad Connie for New Mexico. And always a New Mexican Connie. Oh my god, that was so freaking long, but it's over now, thankfully. Anyways, this video is once again inspired by Cal Unit Productions' 10 words or less videos, and from various other people's 10 words or less videos on other railroad related stuff. But I said mine at 15 words because I still felt like there was more to talk about some of these steam locomotives that I just didn't think that I could put in 10 words. And so I added another 5, hence the 15. If you're wondering what locomotive types I plan on doing next, I plan on doing the 262 Prairies or the 460 10-wheelers. However, the consolidations list has been so long, and the 10-wheelers and Prairies have likely had just as many, if not more operators than the consolidations. So I have considered going to a wheel arrangement that has had fewer operators like the 242 Columbians or some 10-driver types like the Santa Fe's and the Texas types. I also have a spin-off video of these videos in the works currently, and what it'll be, you may ask? Well, be patient and the patience will reward you. Thank you for watching, and until next time, sparkle, sparkle, sparkle. But most importantly, have a good day. Sorry guys, I had a cardiac arrest off camera after looking at the consolidations list. What's next? What about the others?